Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11 of World History. Let's go ahead and dive right into it by going back to Russia. And the last time we checked in with Russia, they were under the leadership of Ivan III. He's the one who married into the Byzantine Empire and began to sort of align Russia, this wild, wonderful country in the far eastern end of Europe, with the Byzantine Church, with the Western Roman Catholic Church, if you will. He saw his nation as the new Rome, so you can see where he's clearly was like all these Renaissance dudes we've been talking about, so far as they were influenced by the classics. His grandson eventually took the throne, also named Ivan. He was only 3, was the younger Ivan, when his father died in 1533. Of course, he was next in line to be the ruler of the Russian Empire, but at age 3, there's only so much you can do. So he's in court, and it was, kept by a steward. And evidently in court, he was treated very, very badly by some of the power brokers who wanted some of their people to have more political influence. He was clothed in rags and barely fed, just an odd case of child neglect, intentional child neglect on the part of the people in the Russian court. It was part of of course, a secret cover-up for a power struggle that was underway at the time. His mother, Elena, was murdered by family rivals when he was only 8 years old. His favorite nurse was taken away from him. Again, he was treated very, very shabbily by those who were running the affairs of the Russian court. And of course, he became known as Ivan the Terrible, and you can sort of draw your own conclusions about this very terrible childhood and what impact it might have had on him. By the age of 13, Ivan was starting to assert himself, and even though he was not officially the ruler at that point, he had another person in the court thrown to a pack of wild dogs and killed, and at the age of 17, he found himself he crowned himself basically, not just as the leader, but as the first Tsar of Russia. He considered himself an autocrat, meaning he answered to no one. Again, he took this title at the tender age of 17. He first order of business was marrying someone, and he found his wife, Anastasia Romanova. Her name is important. Keep that in mind. Again, he had a national assembly, sort of like a parliament or an advisory council, but he made it very clear early on that he was not really interested in anything they had to say. He was an autocrat. What he said was the law. Now, in fairness, all of his laws were not bad. He evidently had at least some kind of talent for some kind of a legal mind. He rewrote old laws and centralized some of the loose ends of his kingdom, and he began to expand the borders of Russia by acquiring new lands. He started to trade in some of the Caspian Sea areas along the Volga River. This did an awful lot for trade in Russia. Again, east and west trade was very much a problem at this point. But he defeated some of the Muslim Tartars north of Turkey once, and he celebrated by ordering the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral. And it stands today as a very much a landmark, very much a symbol of Russia. If you're watching a Russian documentary and they show symbols of Mother Russia, the St. Basil's Cathedral is one of the things you'll see, that very unique architecture, and you can see the obvious Islamic and Byzantine influences there. It's still considered to be probably Russia's most famous landmark. The Russians nicknamed him the Terrible after some of these early victories, insofar as he was a terrible person to have to, a person to be feared. He was a terrible person to deal with, I guess, insofar as that he was feared and respected. Now, later, Russians would consider him terrible for the way we would translate the world, as in being a very terrible human being. He did, though. One of his ambitions was to really pick up trade with Europe. He saw quite naturally that there were things that could be produced in Europe that they simply could not produce in Russia. A daring British explorer named Richard Chancellor sailed from England to Russia through the frigid waters around Scandinavia. So again, we've talked in the past about the Cape of Good Hope and that southern route to Asia. He took an overland route through some of the most treacherous seas, the Arctic Ocean, the Bering Sea, to get to Russia to establish a very unusual trade route. Russians, just as a matter of their culture, remained very suspicious of other Europeans for centuries. And so the idea of the wild, unlimited, unrestricted trade with Europe never came about. The people of Russia were very, very parochial in that sense. They did not trust outsiders. Ivan, as it turned out, because of the trade routes he did establish, became one of the wealthiest men on the planet. But Russia, the people, suffered greatly under the feudal system that his grandfather, Ivan III, began. Peasants remained poor, roads unpaved, the masses were illiterate. Only those at the very, very tip-top of Russian society had any kind of education whatsoever. In 1560, when he was 27 years old, Ivan the Terrible's wife, Anastasia, died. Ivan believed she was poisoned by some of his rivals, and he really seemed to go crazy after this. Evidently, he genuinely loved her. This was not just a marriage for political convenience. It was weird. What he did was, in a letter, he resigned as the Tsar of Russia. And he assured the masses that he loved them, and he hoped that they would do well without him. Well, the oddest thing happened. That letter, which was widely distributed and read and communicated throughout Russia, made him very popular with the peasants, even though you could definitely say his policies created a lot of peasants. In trying to resign, he won the hearts of the poor people of Russia, and they practically begged him to return to power. And that's exactly what he did. Maybe it was a happy accident, maybe it was a calculated move, but as it stood, when Ivan resumed the throne of Russia, he had the people behind him. He took control of Russia like no one had ever done before. He was an autocrat. It was his way or no way. He created a whole new class of citizens to surround him, to protect him. Old members of nobility were literally kicked out of their neighborhoods and replaced by Ivan's new protectors. They called it the Oprachina, or separate estate. What we would call it today is sort of a secret police. Group of citizens who were 100% loyal to Ivan. They enslaved peasants. They murdered conspirators. Again, like I said, they kicked the landowners out of their homesteads. Basically, their only rule was to do whatever Ivan wanted them to do. Russia very quickly, if they were not already, became a two-class society. This disunity ruined the economy and, as you would imagine, dampened the spirit of Russians for a very, very long time. At the city of Novgorod, for example, was rumored that a revolt was brewing against Ivan, and it might have been true. Again, he was not very popular at this point. Without investigating, the Oprachinki went on a rampage of destruction that lasted 5 weeks. They murdered hundreds of citizens. Again, this is some secret police stuff here. And the peculiar thing about Ivan is that throughout his reign, he proclaimed to be a very religious man. He did all the things, all the outward appearances of praying at the right time, going to Mass every so often or quite often. But at the same time, he did everything to instill fear in people around him. He was an excessive drinker, for one thing. One of some of the stories of his drinking escapades were just legendary. In war, he allowed his troops to brutalize women they captured. And even with that, he got crazier as he got older. He hit his pregnant daughter-in-law for dressing immodestly one day, one of his son's wives, and it caused her to lose the baby she was carrying. Naturally, her husband, Ivan's son, reacted. In a scuffle, Ivan hit him and killed him. So Ivan was apparently quite a fighter, too. And Ivan after he sobered up, evidently, never forgave himself. He wailed day and night. He died of some kind of strange disease. Ivan's life was quite terrible, no doubt about it. He earned the nickname. His rulership of Russia did not create the two-class society, but it really entrenched it. And you can make a very fine argument that Russia is still suffering from this today. A lot of Russian culture, Russian mindset, where they were ruled by autocrats, you can see today that's been a consistent problem for Russia over the years. And here today in 2022, they are ruled by an autocrat named Vladimir Putin. We're going to go back to Europe now and go back to the Roman Catholic Church. And again, as the Protestant Reformation picks up steam, those who were still in the Catholic Church, there was a strong move to reform the church. Again, Martin Luther, at the beginning, was not planning on starting the Protestant Reformation. He wanted to fix the Catholic Church from within. When he found out that that was probably not going to be possible, again, the Protestant Reformation really picked up steam. And we're going to look today at two college roommates who brought back a little discipline, a little holiness to the Catholic Church. Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier. Ignatius Loyola was born in Spain. He was benighted at the age of 14, very bright young man, but in a battle against France, he was severely wounded, and that gave him a lot of time to read, and he just dove into it with everything he had. He was most interested in books about courageous saints. He was very much inspired by them. And he made a promise to himself, why can't I serve the Lord like the saints had done before him? One day he claimed he had a vision of Mary and Jesus, and he knelt by his bed and prayed and vowed that the rest of his life he would be what he called a soldier for Christ. He went on a quest for the Holy Grail. Of course, he didn't find it, but again, he was very much enamored with this idea of being an explorer, soldier for Jesus. And he gave away all of his belongings. He promised himself a life of poverty. He also was into self-punishment. I mean, really severe self-punishment. He didn't clean, shave, eat like a normal person did. I mean, he physically punished his body. He saw, in his mind's eye, the more you suffer, the more you care. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us that we have to harm ourselves. We have to discipline ourselves, and sometimes it might feel like harm, but he took it very much to the extreme. There is no biblical basis for self-harm. Again, it's the unmerited grace of God. Remember, it's offered. You don't earn it. But he thought, in his case, that he required that demonstration of faith. He was even arrested and questioned by the Spanish Inquisition for his odd behavior. The same ones that's killing Jews for not converting, even they're telling him, whoa, just chill out a little bit. He wanted to recruit others into his lifestyle, and he didn't have to look very far. He had a roommate when he first went to college named Francis Xavier. Xavier was rich, handsome, smart, evidently quite the ladies' man. He tried his best to ignore his roommate, but as they continued on, evidently they became pretty close friends. Before long, he decided to join Ignatius and a few others in what Ignatius called an extraordinary spiritual journey. In 1534, they met in a small chapel to take a pledge. They promised chastity, poverty, obedience, and allegiance to the Pope. They formed what they called the Society of Jesus. Our old buddy John Calvin, who, of course, Protestant Reformation, kind of scoffed at them and called them Jesuits, which meant people who speak too much about Jesus. Well, the term, even though it was meant as a pejorative, was accepted by the Jesuits, and it stuck, and they're still known as Jesuits today. Their original goal was to reach Jerusalem and convert Muslims. After they figured out that was impractical, they decided then to go directly to Rome and serve the Pope in person. They did whatever was required of them. They cleaned hospital floors, changed bedpans, buried the dead. They had no sponsors, no formal training, no ties to any organization. They asked, though, eventually that the Pope approve of their small order. And in 1540, Pope Paul III did. He gave the soldiers of Christ full blessing and welcomed them into Rome. The members were required to go through very strict training. Ignatius wrote a book called Spiritual Exercises, required reading for these Jesuits, and it focused on the sufferings of Christ. Again, back to the suffering. Ignatius required trainees to practice suffering and other intense disciplines for 2 years as a test of their faithfulness. They also had to have another year of service preaching, another 4 years in theology. It ended up being a 12-year process to get into the Jesuits. Jesuits kept themselves accountable to one another. Again, they did not have a larger organization that was overlooking them. On one hand, it had to be refreshing to those who had lost hope in the future of the Catholic Church to have people like this who were truly devoted to the Church, not just as an institution, but as an instrument of God. Ignatius Loyola was elected the first General Superior of the Society of Jesus, and to his everlasting credit, he made sure that colleges were created for Catholics all throughout Europe. And in America today, there are about 10 major universities named Loyola Marymount, whatever. St. Ignatius is another American university. As for Francis Xavier, he was one of the first and most successful Catholic missionaries. He traveled about 5,000 miles in 1 year alone, and he had a unique ability to understand and respect the culture of his audience. As a result, he was one of the very few people allowed into Japan during this time when Japan was very much a closed nation. And he is credited with converting 150,000 Japanese to Catholicism. He died at the age of 46 on an island off the coast of China, waiting for permission from their government to come and minister to the people of China. Again, one of the most effective means of witnessing for Christ is the willingness to meet people where they are. That means more than just physically. That means respecting their culture and approaching them as an equal, not as someone 10 steps over them, saying you should do this or whatever. So he was very, very effective. And again, there's a whole bunch of universities in the U.S. and all over the world named Xavier. The largest one's in Cincinnati, but there's at least 3 others in the U.S. So you can see that this Jesuit order, and Jesuits are still very much an active order within the Catholic Church. There's several Jesuit universities in the U.S. So by many standards, even though they were eccentric, they were very, very successful. By the end of the 16th century, most European nations had pretty much cast their lot on whether they were going to be primarily a Catholic nation or a Protestant nation. Very few of them switched sides really after this. Catholics, generally speaking, had a strong presence in Ireland and Belgium, all of France, the southern part of Germany, the old Holy Roman Empire, which is mostly Germany and a bit of Poland, along with Italy, Spain, and the Poland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Now, the Protestants, meantime, generally speaking, stayed strong in England, Henry VIII, Scotland, north of England, the Netherlands, northern and eastern Germany, Scandinavia, and, of course, Switzerland. You'll remember the Anabaptists. To strengthen the church, Pope Paul III called a series of important meetings called the Council of Trent, where the Catholic Church tried to take a very sober look at themselves as an institution and to try to answer the challenges that the Protestant Reformation had presented. It was their sort of Catholic Reformation or counter-Reformation. Catholic leaders, though, remained very steadfast in most of their doctrine. They did not change an awful lot. They still thought that they were in the right. The teachings of Thomas Aquinas were upheld. All Protestant doctrine condemned. They determined that the Holy Scriptures were safer in the hands of a priest rather than the hands of a common man. The line in the sand was thus drawn between Protestants and Catholics. And Protestants would stand by the Word of God as their inspiration, while Catholics would stand by the Church as their source of inspiration. And these groups remain divided today, largely still along those lines. The Jesuits in particular were very stringent in persecuting Protestants. So while we've said glowing things about the Jesuits today, and we should, they were not above some strong-handed tactics. Again, when you think you're doing something for God, you can justify an awful lot. We've said that before, and it bears repeating. We're going to go back now to North America. You know, in our globe-trotting journeys here, we've gone all over the place. Those of you who were with me last year know that we've explored civilizations in India, China, Japan, South America, even Australia. We've looked at Central America. One place we haven't been is where we live, North America. Much like all of the other stuff, it was rumored to be a land full of gold and fountain of youth even, and it was just sitting there ripe for the taking. The explorers who were, again, beginning to settle in the Caribbean and opening up trade there, and of course we do have the circumnavigation of the globe, they saw North America as this wild, untapped wilderness. It did not attract their attention at first, but again, the stories came. The city of gold, the fountain of youth. So there were more than curious people who began to literally set foot in North America. One of the first was a guy you've probably heard, Ponce de Leon. Of course, today is known for his futile attempt to find the fountain of youth. He traveled with Columbus in his second voyage to Central America, settled there, eventually became governor of Puerto Rico, and was told by the local people that, you know, up to the north there's a huge landmass that is just brimming with gold and jewels. Man, you really ought to go check it out. Now, it could be they just wanted him the heck out of there, but it worked. In 1513, he sailed to what's now Florida, looking for this miraculous fountain of youth. Of course, he did not find it. It does not exist. But he did name the land Pascua Florida, which is Spanish for flowery Easter. And of course, the name Florida stuck. 8 years later, he went back to Florida with a much larger contingent, still hoping to find this fountain of youth. He instead founded the city of St. Augustine and started a colony there, but it was not a permanent colony. It was the first colony in North America by Europeans, but it didn't last. The first permanent settlement, of course, we being good Virginians knows, Jamestown, 1607. I think we'll be talking about that later. The fighting that he had with the natives over St. Augustine was just a taste of what was to come. Meantime, much further to the north, the French had their eyes on parts of North America as they tried to find another land route to the east to do trade with China and whatnot. And so this huge landmass to the north, they saw it and they sent an explorer to check it out, to see where this land led. Jacques Cartier was looking for a shortcut to the spices of Asia, and he bumped into Canada. Huge landmass, 4 million square miles. He made 3 different trips to Canada. The first, he sailed beyond Newfoundland out to the Far East and to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and near the present-day province of Quebec. They were greeted warmly by 50 Indians from the Micmac tribe who offered friendship early on. So, again, at first, everything was cool. He found the opening of the St. Lawrence River, dumped into the Great Lakes, of course, not the Atlantic Ocean. But along the way, they began to establish what would become a permanent fur trade with the Indians. In Quebec, he met about 200 Huron Indians and their chief Donnacona, while there Cartier put up a large cross and claimed the land. Well, these Indians basically said, what do you mean, claim the land? We were here. And Cartier lied to them and said, oh, it's just a landmark, nothing to be concerned about. Well, he convinced the chief, that is, de Cartier, to send his 2 sons back to France and get an education. They did, and he returned with them a few years later with the boys who now spoke French, and they were used as guides to move up and down the St. Lawrence River to trap, get fur, and trade. He visited one Huron village that was set on a hill, and he called it Mount Royal, later to become Montreal. And the name Canada, by the way, came from the Huron word for village, which is Kanata. That first winter back on the second journey, proved to be very harsh. Ships got frozen in layers of thick ice. Cartier's men began to suffer from scurvy. The chief, Donnacona son, provided a remedy that they had made from tree bark, which obviously had vitamin C in it because it helped scurvy. Cartier repaid him by capturing Donnacona and 9 other Huron, and he wanted them to go back with him to France to stand before the king and talk about all these cities filled with gold so the king would finance more expeditions. It would look good and give Cartier a chance, an excuse to return to the New World. Unfortunately, while they were there, the chief died in France, as did every other person that came with them. They were clearly exposed to diseases that they had not been exposed to before and died. When he came back without the chief, the Huron Indians were not very friendly anymore, as you could imagine. His men were attacked. They were killed by Native Americans, even though they opened up what became a permanent fur trade between North Americans and the French. The French influence up and down the St. Lawrence River would have to be taken by force now because they had quite understandably enraged the locals. And of course, that part of Canada today is a heavy French influence. French is still the official language there. You go up and down the St. Lawrence River and all throughout Canada are outposts, and they all have French names. While he was exploring Canada, a Spanish explorer was exploring the southern part of North America. Hernando de Soto, 25 years after Ponce de Leon's fruitless search for the Fountain of Youth, de Soto, again, was lured by promises of gold. And you would think they would learn by now, but evidently they found enough to keep them going. De Soto, though, unlike De Leon, was actively cruel to the natives from the very get-go. He sought to enslave the Native Americans and to have them look for gold for him. He also brought along priests and monks to care for their spiritual needs, but again, I know it gets old. It sounds exactly like what we were talking about with Columbus and others, right? The thing is that these Europeans saw these natives as pagans, as savages. So they were not fully human in their eyes. They weren't animals, they were above animals, but not quite human. When you refuse to fully grant someone their humanity, you can justify doing almost anything to them. And that holds true today. You'll remember the manner in which Pizarro wiped out the Incans of Peru. De Soto and his men really did a number on the natives in Florida. About 11,000 Indians were killed in their first year there. But again, to keep him on the move, they kept telling him stories about gold over there to the west. Go over there and you'll find all the gold you'll ever need. So he ended up exploring an area basically from Alabama to South Carolina. He saw the Blue Ridge and the Ozark Mountains, parts of Tennessee. He also made it to the Mississippi River and sailed south on there. But in terms of finding gold, it was a vast failure. The final early North American explorer we'll mention is Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He went over the future states of New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Oklahoma. And again, the Pueblo Indians this time told him a legend of the 7 cities of Cibola that were made of gold with the doors inlaid with rubies. And of course, the Spaniards fell for it. Greed will make you dumb. He gathered 300 Spaniards and hundreds of slaves that he made of the Native Americans to trek through the Southwest. They discovered the Grand Canyon, the Continental Divide, but not a great deal of gold. Coronado eventually retired in Mexico City, and eventually, this is odd, he was charged by the Spanish government with poor treatment of the Native Americans. So at least there is some lip service being paid to human rights here, even in this time of human history where might makes right. It still was acknowledging that slavery was a crime. It's nice that that thought existed. Wish it had existed more. Anyway, it's hard to talk about the explorers sometimes, again, mostly because of the Native American experience. But it happened, and we will talk about it more on Monday. See you then.